Thank you very much for the introduction. And thanks a lot for being here. It's a real pleasure. It's a great campus. It's my first time here. It's really nice to see all these places and all the new people here. All right, so I'm going to talk about neuromorphic cognition. I'll be explaining what neuromorphic means in these slides and what I mean by the neuromorphic cognition, which is something that's not very usual, as you'll see. But I think a very good introduction to what neuromorphic hardware is this exposition that we created for first 10-year-old students back in Switzerland, which explains what what neuromorphic hardware is using cups in water. I mean, it's actually a movie. Let's see here. All right. So what you see here are some plastic cups here that are being filled by this stream of water that's pouring in. And as the water reaches some level, these cups tip over. So this is kind of, it's a mechanical model of an integrated fire arm. It's integrating water, and it's firing by releasing its contents in this funnel. In this funnel, and then the water that gets released, poured here, is directed to this third cup down here. And this cup here, it has these are leaky integrated fire neurons because there's even a little hole that you can adjust. This neuron would only fire when these two the cups tip over at the same time, and that's going to happen right now. And then it tips over. So what this, that's me saying, yeah. So what this network shows you is that this this neuron acts as a coincidence detector. It's basically detecting the coincidence when these two are spiking at the same time. So neuromorphic hardware is not about playing with water and cups, but it's building physical implementations of neurons. Not with plastic cups, but with using silicon. In fact, the same technology as we have in our computers. Okay. All right. Okay. So one of the big questions that drive this field is how can we build these systems so that we can do intelligent processing, intelligent low-power processing, because this is one of the real main drives of this technology. So imagine we have some information processing system. We'll just call it a neuromorphic processor, something that has in the order of 1 million neurons. These are the kind of systems that we'll be seeing, that we're seeing now and we'll see in the next 5–10 years. A system that would take inputs in terms of some, this is a silicon retina that produces spikes as intensity changes in the visual field, and the system actuates a robot arm for to perform some task. The main feature, as I said, is that these systems use very low power. In fact, they're in the order of picojoules per synaptic operation. So the synaptic operation is the equivalent of the Mac, the multiply and accumulate in the computer. So that it's a very small. It's very low power, and also it can process in real time because these are physical systems, just like in the cups in the water. Things are happening as they happen. So one of the big questions was, well, once we have this system, how can we actually wire all these neurons together to do something smart? Right? If I give you 1 million neurons, what are you going to do with that? So we can try to go through how the computer architecture people would do this, is to look at, well, what is the computation that we're trying to solve? What is the algorithm that can be used to solve that problem or task? And how can we implement these in these systems? So I already told you that the implementation here is going to be about the neuromorphic systems. VLSI here means the very large scale implementation, which is basically hand drawing all these transistors. The computations that we're interested in are naturally going to be the computations that the brain is good at doing. And this can be, for example, so a cognitive task, something like recognizing an object, or recognizing speech, or playing a game, or performing two alternative voice choice tasks for comparisons with neuroscientific data and so on. And the real question is really, what is the algorithm that takes you from this cognitive task to the implementation? Now, of course, this is the big question that the computational neuroscientists are trying to solve. And what I will be talking to you about will be, in fact, something that combines ideas of machine learning and computational neuroscience. And as I said, the goal of this whole endeavor is, well, on one hand, to build a technology that is very low power. But on the other hand, it's also that when you build these systems, you also get to understand how they work better, better how they work. And this reflects one of Feynman's quotes saying that, well, what I cannot create, I don't understand. So if you can create them, then you have a better handle on how they work. And there's another, I think, quote that really drives the development of these systems, that the constraints of the medium that is used to develop these devices, which are analog silicon systems, essentially the same kind of hardware that we have here, but just used in a different operating regime. The constraints are similar in that the wire is limited, the power is precious, and robustness and reliability are essential. So finding a good solution in terms of these neuromorphic hardware can also be an interesting solution, something that the brain exploits as well. Okay. And it turns out that actually there are this person here, Carver Mead, who's at Caltech, is the person who pioneered this field. He noticed that at the level of the transistor, the dynamics, the ionic of the ion channels, and the electronic currents to the transistor are the same. So, building on this, you can actually mimic the parts of the brain by building these circuits, so building transistors and groups of circuits, and then multiple chips and so on, to build these whole systems, large-scale systems. Okay. Yeah, that was what this figure was supposed to show. So the idea is that really, so we take the blueprint of a neuron. We describe a model of this neuron here. This is the equation, just a formal way of writing what an intriguing fire neuron is, and mapping these onto the silicon. This is really at the level of the designer, what he sees. So there's literally a capacitor here and a transistor here for injecting some current, and a bunch of transistors here for taking care of the spiking dynamics, the fact that the neuron spikes and so on. Okay. So that. So this takes me to the implementation of these systems. In fact, there's been a lot of people working on these systems. There's been and multiple different approaches. So the approach I was talking to you about, they're called the analog processing and the analog asynchronous systems. There's been a group at UC San Diego, where in fact where I did my own postdoc, which has these large systems in the order of 50,000 neurons, 60,000 neurons. And the group in Zurich, which is also building large-scale systems that have plasticity, so synaptic plasticity integrated inside the chip so they can learn. There's a very strong group in Stanford that were the first to develop this million neuron system. And there's also a group within the Human Brain Project in Europe that is building very large wafer scale, so chips essentially this big, containing large arrays of neurons. So this has been the old approach, so to say, the approach that was pioneered by Carver Mead. Now recently there's been, as industry has been getting involved, there's been more fully digital processing. Actually, I realized I didn't explain the difference between analog and digital. It's really an analog. You read, instead of having just binary zeros, so the inactive and the active state, you have all the grades in between. So it's potentially much more interesting because you have all this grading of the states. It's also much more difficult to control. So this is why the industry went through a digital paradigm, so that they can use all of the same tools that they had for, as they had in the, as they use, for example, for building processors. And this is, there's also another group in the Human Brain Project called the Spinnaker, which has large arrays of these processors. In fact, every one of here, every little black box here is a processor of the type you find in your cell phone. They're all wired together in a way that is inspired by the brain. And there's the IBM's latest chip, which is a single chip that has 1 million neurons. That was developed through the DARPA Synapse project that also Chris here was involved in. And of course, there will be software simulations of these neurons. The point I want to make here is that given all these different implementations, at least I'm starting to realize that, and Carver Mead realized this a long time ago, is that our ability to create simple neural functions is not limited by the availability of the hardware, but really by the organizing principles. So, and this is the question that I'm really targeting in my research. By the way, if you have questions, just feel free to interrupt me. I would appreciate it because I'm becoming sick, or my throat is starting to hurt. So, all right, so let's go to the computation. I'll just pick a particular task so I can explain what I've been doing. So let's look at this. There's this monkey looking at a screen that sees digits and letters coming after another, and this monkey presses either the left button or the right button. And we show this monkey. We're doing this task, which is called the 1-2-AX task, which I'll explain here. So the numbers indicate a subtask. If the monkey sees the number 1, then it has to attend to the sequence A followed by X. Okay, and if it sees the subtask, the number 2, then it has to attend to the sequence B followed by Y. And if it sees, once it recognizes the sequence, it presses the right button, and otherwise it just always presses the left button. And this is just a task that, in fact, people have designed to understand the capabilities of it. That could be used in a lab setting. I'm not sure this one was particularly used in a lab setting or not. Without going into the details, a state machine can solve this task. So a state machine is just a computational model that switches its internal state depending on the inputs that it receives. In fact, let's look at here 1-AX. So starting at the initial state here, if I get a 1, this arrow means I move to the state here. There's a 1 here. And if I take a, I go here, and then we see an X, we go here. And this R means that we press R. Right. And then if we go to task 2, then we switch from this one to here, and then we see the sequence B followed by R. So this state machine, in fact, can you can check that it really completes this task successfully. So this begs the question: well, is there a way that the brain can represent things like state machines? This is a reasonable thing to ask. And this brings me to how we're going to put together the computation and the machine learning. Before I get to how we solve that particular problem, let me explain you how we decided to solve this problem. So this was my actually my PhD project with in Zurich. A driving theme was to in that institute was to use soft winner-take-all systems, which are you can see them as a group of excitatory neurons that are connected locally in the nearest neighbor fashion to each other, and to a group of inhibitory neurons which inhibit them back. Okay. This type of network can do a bunch of interesting things, and I've listed 3 of the properties here. One is selective amplification. In fact, what we really call winner-take-all is that if you show 2 signals, so 2 bumps to this network at 2 different locations, then it's going to, if you set the parameters right, it's going to amplify the strongest bump, and it's going to silence the other bump. Okay, so that's what we really call the winner-take-all. Kind of a side product of this is that if you have a bump that's buried in noise, the network is going to amplify the stronger bump here, and so get rid of the noise. So we can say that it's doing some sort of signal restoration. And if you recall what I said about this parallel between the silicon and biology systems, is that this idea of signal restoration is really key to how the brain computes, because as opposed to a computer which resets all of its states to 0s and 1s, which you can see as a way of restoring the signal, there is no such signal restoration in these analog systems. And this type of signal restoration really plays that role. And it's an analog signal restoration. And finally, if you show, again, if you set the parameters just right, if you show 2 signals that have the same height, just depending on the random noise, it's going to choose one signal and the other, and it's going to stick to it. Okay. So this means that it can even be the case that when you remove the input, this activity is going to remain. And this is called the multi-stability. And you can already see here the bits and parts of what are needed to build these state machines, right? Because multi-stability is really going to be what is going to allow you to maintain the state from the previous step. So in this project, the idea was really to take the soft winner-take-all as a building block for general purpose computation that is reliable thanks to its signal restoration capabilities. And in terms of the implementation, I'm not going to go into details here, but essentially one of these chips that we had a large number of these winner-take-alls that we could couple together in an arbitrary fashion, and also parameterize them in a way that they would show these three behaviors. So this is, and now coming back to this idea of the 1-2 AX tasks and the state machines. So the idea was really to start with the description of the state machine. Now this is a very simple state machine. It's really, it's flip-flop. So it switches from the red state to the blue state each time I show the input X. And when it does this, it also outputs the letter A if it goes from blue to red, and it outputs B if it goes from red to blue. So this is the simplest state machine you can imagine. The idea to implement the state machine is to have multiple winner-take-alls. One of these winner-take-alls has this multi-stable behavior that, say, this here, assume that this is a group of neurons. If you excite this group of neurons, then it would become active. And when you remove the input, it would continue being active. So this means that you're in the blue state. Okay? There is a transition winner-take-all network, which is parameterized such that it only activates when it receives 2 inputs. In this case, one from the input layer, one representing the input X, and one coming from the state. So in this case, for example, if we're in the blue state and we get an X, we get 2 inputs here, and 1 input here, 1 input here, 1 input here. This one feeds the whole column, and this one feeds the whole row. Well, when this neuron activates, and if we connect this neuron to the red state, then it would initiate a transition from blue to red. Okay, so this is, you can see this winner take all here as being the one that contains the information of which transition should be done. Okay, and then we could also connect this one to a layer, to another layer that represents the outputs A or B. So what you see here is really like a number of winner-take-alls that are put together to implement a state machine. And you can see that already that this is quite general, that I can represent any type of state machine using this type of construct just by wiring appropriately these dashed arrows. So if I can do this with the flip-flop, I can also do it with the same state machine as I had in this more complex task, the 12AX task earlier. And finally, since I already explained to you earlier that we can implement these winner-take-all systems in hardware. So we have basically for each of these circles, we're going to have a little group of neurons that is going to represent a given state or a given transition population. So this is exactly what we did. So we did it in the case of the 12AX task. So this is just a different representation of exactly the same state machine as we had earlier, the 12AX task. So we start in the idle state, and then we get an input that's an input which is, well, it's called QB, which is actually represents the digit 2 in the N12AX, and then right and left, which are the 2. I should explain that this is, so it's the same, it's a task that has the same state machine as in the 12AX task, but just the inputs were labeled differently because they were provided through a visual stimulus. But you can believe me that this is exactly the same thing as the 12AX. And this is the output from the hardware system, so where each of these little dots here represent a spike coming out of this chip. So in looking at this particular trajectory, starting from idle, and then from yellow to red and red to green, you can see it here. So start from idle, it gets an input CB, and switches and switches and then switches back here. And as it switches back here, it also outputs the letter B. Here. Oops. All right. And so the way that this was solved was really, so there was we had a network of these winner-take-all systems, and also a silicon retina that read, that looked at a screen with these moving bars that would be pre-processed inside. We had some portion that was done on the computer, and the rest was done on the chain of neuromorphic chips. So this experiment was, I think, one of the really the first to put together a visual stimulus and actually do processing all in real time through this neuromorphic state machine. So it was quite an achievement for us at that time to be able to do this. And the very interesting part again is the programmability of this system. In fact, we could implement any type of state machine. You could even just draw your state machine, press enter, and wire up your network in order to generate this behavior. And this is quite much, at least it's getting closer to how we use computers, right? I mean, we like to program in Python or MATLAB or say in C. And when we decide to run this program, it also gets compiled in a language that our processor understands. And the idea was similar here. So we draw this state machine, and it gets the network gets compiled in order to solve this particular task. So those tasks those state machines are very good at with dealing with deterministic stimuli, but of course the natural question is, well, how can we optimally deal with uncertain cues, which is what we're really exposed to in the real world. Take for example this image. If you've already seen it, you know that there's a cow on it. Otherwise, you might not understand what's on this figure. Right? You might see a skull here with teeth, but actually there's a cow here. Okay. And this is an example of inference, in that if you know what's there, I tell you there's a cow. So you're really putting together your knowledge, your high-level knowledge, with this low-level information that you're getting through your eyes. And this idea of perceptual inference was mostly attributed to Helmholtz a long time ago, and it's moved. It's been a driving theme in the computational neuroscience field right now, and science of this perceptual inference, and the fact that this perceptual inference is optimal, has been observed in humans and also in animals. In this case, we have that the human actually takes into account the uncertainty of the cues, so a visual cue or a proprioceptive cue, in order to figure out the position of a given stimulus. And it turns out that this is consistent throughout and this is optimal in terms of the uncertainty that is provided at the visual and the proprioceptive stimuli. So this begs the question: are there quantitative models of probabilistic inference at the neural level? Maybe something that we can also relate to the state machines, as we saw earlier, if we're doing inference, basically state-dependent, probabilistic state-dependent computation. We're not quite there yet, but there are some subdomains where we can do this very well. And I'll be explaining this right now. Now, what I'm going to be talking about is more where the idea of the machine learning comes in. So before I start talking about this, one of the things that we were very interested in is neural networks and deep neural networks. So they made a lot of deep neural networks are the state of the art in many tasks. So they're naturally a good place to start from. Another idea why deep learning is interesting for this type of hardware is that even in deep learning, most of the advances are attributed to the fact that there's more hardware, that we have access to low-cost GPUs for learning these systems. And a lot of the breakthroughs can be attributed to that. So if you can find a hardware system like neuromorphic hardware and use it in a way that goes to the benefit of deep learning, then this is a very good. Then it's a very good thing to do. So one of the building blocks of deep learning, at least in the process of generating the research that's being done now, was the Boltzmann machine, and you might have heard of the restricted Boltzmann machine. They are stochastic neural networks. So in this case, they have every node here is associated to a binary random variable, and all these connections here are basically edges between these neurons that can represent, for example, synapses between the two neurons and so on. So because these are random variables, there's a probability distribution that is governing the state of these nodes. And that probability distribution, in the case of the Boltzmann machine, is given by the Boltzmann distribution. If you've never heard of Boltzmann machines, but you've heard of Hopfield networks, then you know what a Boltzmann machine is. They're exactly the same thing, except that Boltzmann machines have noise. in addition to the Hopfield network. Or if you're a physicist, then these are exactly the same thing as Ising networks. So the idea really of the Boltzmann machine was in fact to take the Hopfield network and to add noise to these systems so that they can avoid the local minima as they're learning. So in this case, it's really the idea of shaking the dynamics so that these states can fall into lower states of energy here, which is where the dynamics leads you. If you let it. Okay. So it turns out that learning in the Hopfield network is very easy. The weights, in fact, should just be equal to the covariances, the average covariances in the input. So Zi, Zj would be two random variables in this network, and the weight between the two should just be equal to the average of this data. In the Boltzmann machine, it's almost the same rule. So we have the same part here, which is this covariances of the data. But there's another part here, which is the covariances of the states while the network is reconstructing. And what reconstructing means is that you don't provide any input to it, just let it generate some activity in its visible layer. I should have said that there's a visible layer and a hidden layer in these networks. This is where the network is, the data is shown. The reconstruction is really going so the weight change should be the average over the data variances minus the reconstruction covariances. And this term is unfortunately hard to evaluate. And the reason is that this learning rule actually really comes from the fact that you're maximizing log likelihood. And if you take the log of this, then you see that you end up with this z term here, and that z term is the partition function. And as it usually goes, partition functions are hard to evaluate. So evaluating this is impossible for any reasonably sized network, and even evaluating it approximately is pretty hard. So people went around this in trying to, so as I said, to approximate it using Markov chain Monte Carlo techniques. So, okay, this is all nice. This is not really related, until this point, was not really related to neurons in the brain as we saw before. But it does provide us, given that a network can produce these types of dynamics, at least sample from these types of dynamics, then we at least have a learning rule to train it. So it's interesting, it's potentially interesting that if we know how to sample with neurons, then we can actually apply this learning rule and train our networks to learn interesting distributions. In fact, the distributions of the data. And this is this is called, this idea of sampling the network is called neural sampling. So we have this network here, which is the same network as before, just flipped. And at each node here, we associate a neuron, an interunifier neuron, but that is stochastic. In fact, you see that it's stochastic because its membrane potential here is wiggling around. And it's spiking at random times. We interpret as a sample, or basically whether the neuron spikes or not during a certain time window. So for example, at this time step here, the sample generated by this network is 0, 1, 0, 0, which really corresponds to the fact that there's no spike here, there was a spike here, no spike, no spike, no spike. And at every point in time, you can generate one of these samples. Okay. And now this is where the interesting part comes in. So there's a group in Austria that showed that if the probability of a neuron firing is a logistic function, and the input is just the standard linear sum of the inputs at the synapses, then these samples, these random vectors, are distributed according to the Boltzmann distribution. So this, in fact, these two pieces of information tell us how we can build a network of neurons that can sample from the Boltzmann distribution that we saw before here. And so we showed that also biophysical neural models can meet these conditions, and we can apply the same learning rule as we saw because we have these samples now. We can apply the same learning rule as we had seen in the previous slide to learn to basically train this network. And this learning. So this is going to be my most technical slide. I'm sorry, so feel free to ask questions. Yes?
On the previous slide, where it says contrastive divergence, do you just mean delta rule, or do you mean something more specific?
In fact, this here, yes, thanks for asking that. So this here is, if you approximate this, so an approximation of this is called the contrastive divergence. It's almost the same rule, except it just depends on the way that you generate the Zi and Zj. It's actually right. Well, actually, this is the contrastive divergence. I can explain it right now. So this is the same rule as we saw before, except I just replaced the Zi's with V and H. And this was a very powerful, actually, machine learning technique in the early 2000s, and really is believed to have started, at least rebooted some of the research in this field. So the idea to generate this DeltaW is to sample in this way. So you take some value in the visible layer and you propagate them to the hiddens, and you do this a couple of times, but not too many times. In fact, just once is actually enough. And the difference in this, basically this times this minus this times this, gives you the contrastive divergence rule. And why is this the case? It's just because when you propagate the visibles to the hiddens, because of the way that this particular network was wired, you get a sample in the data phase here. And then once you go up and down a few times, you're actually effectively trying to reconstruct what you had in the data layer. And that's why this term here, which corresponds to this times this, is called the reconstruction. And really the key idea is that running this a small number of times is enough for generating a reasonably good learning signal. Interestingly, the way that I heard through a close collaborator of Jeff Hinton, who created this rule, that this was mostly found by accident, just because it took so much time to do this. Ideally, you should do this an infinite number of times, but because the data needed to be generated quickly, they just set this parameter to say 2 or 3, and it worked surprisingly well. So that's how this rule came up. And then people tried to explain why it works so well. Okay, so that was just a digression. So the idea is that we can take a similar rule like this and implement it using this idea of neural sampling and plasticity, as we have in spiky neurons, which is commonly STDP. And the way that it works is, so now we have a network that can produce samples from the visible and the hidden layers. And we just need to basically set up this network such that when we show data, the synapses are going to potentiate. So that's when you show the data, that's the blue curve. In fact, I'm sorry, I should probably explain. This is the learning window of the STDP rule, which means that if 2 spikes occur at the same time, they're going to potentiate or depotentiate. And for this particular rule, for the event-driven contrastive divergence, if when you're showing the data, this curve has to be positive, and when you reconstruct, this curve is negative. So this means that there has to be some sort of global signal which tells the synapses whether they should be potentiating or depotentiating, which makes this a little bit less biologically plausible. But at least we can. This would be the exact way of doing it, but there's approximations where you can actually also make this work without having this very strong two-phasic rule. And in this case, you can show that really this STDP rule here, combined with the network that does neural sampling, behaves exactly like the machine learning rule as people use. And interestingly, normally people use restricted Watson machines. I guess I haven't gone into that detail earlier, but this network can really is not restricted in the connectivity in the network that it can sample from. So which makes it potentially more powerful. So now we have a stochastic neural network that we can train, and one of the benchmark tests that machine learning people like to use is the recognition of handwritten digits. So this is the MNIST handwritten digits. There are 60,000 of them. And so you train over the 60,000, and then you test over a testing set that you leave out. And here we take the standard network size. By standard, I mean what people usually took for training restricted Watson machines on this task, which is 784 neurons for the visible. That's because the images are 28 by 28. And 500 hidden neurons, and a number of class neurons, so that we can evaluate its performance. I should say here that because of the particular learning rule, you technically don't really need labels. It's a class of neurons that's called the unsupervised learning, which can learn even though there's no supervisor signal. The supervisor signal here is really for us to evaluate its performance on the recognition task. And here we get recognition accuracies which are in the 95%, which actually compare pretty well, and even are slightly better than the standard machine learning algorithm. It's pretty far from what you will find in the state-of-the-art machine learning papers, which are in the 99.7 something. But it's as good as you get usually using unsupervised learning. And interestingly, it's a little bit better. Which might seem odd to you because we were just trying to map the machine learning technique to the spiky neuron. But it turns out that the particular way that we're generating the stochasticity in the network does something called regularization, so it actually helps the learning in this situation. And also because updates are necessarily made at every time you show a digit, versus in machine learning, there are these things called mini batches. So you show batches of say 20 or 100 images at once, so that you can actually use exploit the parallelism of your GPU or of your CPU. So this means that you actually make more updates as you show the samples. So this also helps the learning. So what we've actually gained in this story is, as I said, so we can get errors that are in the order of 4% or a recognition of 95%. But I think the coolest thing here, and this that we've gained, and this ties to what I've said earlier about the probabilistic inference, is that it can do the same network can do several tasks. It can do classification, as I said, so you basically show an image of a digit. This gets propagated to the hidden network, and then propagates back to the layers and says, oh, this is a 3, basically by activating a group of neurons here. So this network here is represented here. It activates a group of neurons that is associated to the label 3. you can reverse this. So you can say, okay, give me a 5, and then this activity would propagate, and it would generate the digit 5 in its visible layer. So its own version of the 5, which is in this case not a very beautiful 5, but you still get an idea for it. And it can do Q integration. So in this case, I show half of a digit 8. And in the labels, I say this is not an 8, but it's a 3 or a 6. In fact, the digit 3 is much more compatible with this half of 8 than is a 6, right? The 6 would have to be a kind of weird 6 like this. That also takes into account this part. So 3 is probably a better explanation for the data here. And this is what the network does. So it completes the rest of the image with the digit of a 3. This is not a property that's due to the spiky nature of the neurons or whatever. This is just something that you would also observe in the machine learning algorithm. But it really illustrates the power of taking principles from the machine learning field and bringing them into the spiky neural networks, because then we have a system that can actually reconstruct this potentially according to optimal rules given under the model that it's learned. Okay, so this actually brings me to the end of the talk, and so the two things that I really wanted to talk about here were that so these inference and learning algorithms can harness really the potential of artificial neural systems. Most of the, by the way, I must say, most of the algorithms I showed you before, they're not running on hardware yet because there's still no hardware that we can use for learning. There's no learning neuromorphic hardware that can be easily used for these tasks. And neuroscience, cognitive science, and machine learning, for the moment, are the main drivers of the search for algorithms, for these types of algorithms. And this is just a list of related contributions that we made. Okay, so let me just thank my collaborators. So this was the people I worked with in Zurich, actually my PhD advisors here. And Gert Kombergs, who was the person with whom I've developed most of these ideas of the probabilistic inference while I was at UC San Diego. And